The training base at Coronado was not a place for laughter, though on the morning she arrived, the sound of it echoed across the sand. A group of men, sunburnt and hardened from weeks of grueling drills, leaned against the side of the obstacle course fence. She was a tall, no-nonsense braid that swayed against her shoulders. To them, she was an anomaly, an outsider daring to step into a brotherhood carved by blood, sweat, and seawater. Some of them smirked, some shook their heads, and one let out a sharp bark of laughter that carried over the crash of waves. "She won't last an hour," someone muttered. They had seen promising candidates collapse before they vomit out their guts after surf torture. Yet she didn't flinch at the jeers. She stood still, eyes scanning the course, the instructors, the horizon, as if imprinting the battlefield in her mind. When the commanding officer barked for the unit to fall in, she stepped into line without hesitation, her boots sinking into the sand with the same weight and authority as every other man. And though the snickers continued, there was a quiet undercurrent to her presence, the kind that didn't need words, the kind that settled into the air like the silence before a storm. The first test came fast and merciless. The instructors wasted no time with introductions. Within minutes, the recruits were pounding across the beach, waves hammering their shins as the sun rose higher, and the instructors screamed for more speed. Sweat streamed down necks and mixed with saltwater spray, boots squelched, muscles burned, and lungs cried out for air. Men who had run marathons cursed under their breath, falling back, stumbling, fighting their own exhaustion. Yet she remained steady. Her stride was efficient, precise, every movement conserving energy, every breath. Her eyes forward, never once acknowledging the whispers or sideways glances. When the pack surged, she surged. When it slowed, she pressed on. By the time they reached the turnaround point, half the group was already dragging, and the laughter that had once filled the morning was swallowed by the sound of heavy breathing. She crossed the line back at base in the top 5, her face calm, her steps still even. An instructor glanced at her, then at the men slumped in the sand. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was enough to plant the first seed of doubt in the others who had mocked her. But running was only the beginning, and it was in the mud where the true tests began. The pit was wide, deep, and unforgiving, churning like a swamp as dozens of boots churned it further into sludge. Recruits were ordered to crawl, drag, and heave themselves through it, weighted down by packs behind. Men cursed, spat mud from their mouths, clawed at the earth with raw fingertips. Some got stuck, thrashing in panic as the muck sucked them deeper. And then there was her. She dropped into the pit without hesitation, her movements smooth, purposeful. Where others flailed, she slithered. Where others sank, she propelled herself forward with controlled, deliberate pulls. Mud coated her face, her arms, her hair, yet her eyes gleamed sharp and unyielding. One of the men, struggling half-blind beside her, sneered, "Still think you can handle this?" She didn't answer. She just surged ahead, pulling herself out of the pit a full 2 minutes before him, standing tall on solid ground as he wheezed behind. When the last of the recruits finally staggered out, the instructors called for push-ups, and though groans rippled across the group, she dropped to the ground instantly, hands sinking into wet earth, with a rhythm that didn't falter. Statement. Every breath was defiance. By the time the set ended, even those who had laughed found themselves stealing glances, measuring her endurance against their own, and realizing uncomfortably that she wasn't the one falling behind. Days blurred into one another, a cycle of punishment and endurance designed to shatter even the strongest wills. Sleep was stolen in fragments, meals were rushed, and every hour seemed like a new assault on body and mind. The ocean became both enemy and ally, icy water meant to numb and weaken, yet also the only reprieve from the blistering sun. The instructors never let up. They pushed, they screamed, they tested limits. And through it all, she never faltered. During log PT, when 6 men were tasked with heaving a massive timber over their heads, she shouldered the weight without flinching, even as one of her teammates buckled under the strain. When they carried rubber boats over their heads across endless stretches of sand, she adjusted her grip and took more of the burden without complaint. At night, when recruits collapsed into restless half-sleep, she stayed quiet, conserving her strength for the next onslaught. It was in those moments of silence that the others began to notice. The laughter was admitted aloud. Pride still held their tongues, but their eyes betrayed them. They watched her now not with scorn, but with calculation, as if trying to understand how she endured what crushed so many of them. and when she caught those stares she never acknowledged them, never sought validation. Her focus was locked on survival, on victory, on something beyond the approval of men who once dismissed her. The day the instructors rolled out the combat drills, the entire unit braced themselves. Everyone knew this was where reputations were made or broken, because no one could hide weakness in hand-to-hand sparring. The recruits were paired off, gloves laced, mouthguards clenched, and ordered to fight until the whistle blew. It wasn't about winning cleanly, it was about proving grit, about showing you could take a hit and still keep moving forward. When her name was called, the smirks returned. Men leaned forward with hungry eyes, eager to see her folded by a real opponent. The instructor pointed at one of the biggest men in the unit, a broad-shouldered former linebacker with arms like tree trunks and a grin that promised pain. He stepped into the circle, bouncing on his heels, while she entered with the same calm steps she always carried, her gloves raised, her chin tucked. For a moment the circle tightened, a current of anticipation running through the sand. The whistle shrieked and he lunged. His fists swung like hammers, his speed surprising for his size, but she didn't meet power with power. She slipped aside, her feet light, her eyes sharp, every movement efficient. His punch cut air, and before he could recover, her jab cracked against his jaw, snapping his head sideways. The circle erupted with shouts, some cheering, some groaning, but the fight was far from over. He snarled, charging again, raining blows that could have broken ribs, yet she absorbed the glancing hits, rolled with them, and answered with combinations that landed clean and precise. Every strike was a statement. She belonged here. By the time the whistle blew, his chest was heaving, his guard sagging, and sweat poured down his temples. She stood in front of him, steady, her gloves still raised, breathing hard but controlled. The instructor's eyes narrowed with a trace of satisfaction as he called the bout. There was no laughter this time, only silence laced with the bitter taste of disbelief. When the next round began and she dismantled another opponent just as ruthlessly, that silence deepened into awe. Combat drills stretched on, each session more grueling than the last. They introduced grappling, takedowns, chokeholds, scenarios where brute strength often dominated. Yet she moved with a precision that frustrated every man who faced her. She didn't overpower them, she outmaneuvered them. When pinned, she found leverage where none seemed possible. When dragged to the ground, she turned her body like a blade, twisting, rolling, escaping holds with practiced skill. The bigger they were, the harder they fell, because frustration led to mistakes, and mistakes were her battlefield. Word spread quickly through the barracks. At night, whispers floated above bunks, some accusing her of getting lucky, others grudgingly admitting she was good, too good to dismiss. Pride made them cling to excuses, but those excuses crumbled with each passing drill. Even the instructors, who never gave praise, began to assign her the toughest opponents, testing her, pushing her, waiting to see where she would break. Yet no matter how many times they tried, she didn't. She absorbed punishment and delivered it back in calculated doses, leaving a trail of humbled men behind her. One evening, after a particularly brutal session, when she dropped her opponent with a flawless sweep and arm lock, an instructor simply muttered, "Textbook," before ordering the next pair. Than any applause, because it meant she wasn't just surviving, she was excelling. As the weeks ground on, fatigue became the unit's constant shadow. Muscles ached perpetually, feet blistered, minds blurred from lack of sleep. Instructors prowled like wolves searching for cracks, and when they found them, they dug mercilessly. Men who had walked in with swagger now dragged themselves through drills with haunted eyes. The ocean claimed some, the mud pit claimed others, and every day the class grew thinner. Yet through it all, she moved with the same steady resilience, as if she had tapped into some hidden reservoir that never ran dry. She was not untouched by the exhaustion. Her shoulders sagged at night, her hands blistered and raw, but she never let it consume her. When others faltered during team drills, she picked up the slack without hesitation, hoisting more of the weight, driving her team forward. Some began to resent her for it, pride stung by the reminder of their own limits, but even resentment couldn't erase the growing recognition that she was carrying them. In the surf torture sessions, when recruits were ordered to lock arms and let icy waves crash over them until teeth chattered and lips turned blue, she refused to shiver, refused to let the cold always raw but unwavering, and slowly, others found themselves rallying to match her energy. Against their will, she became a center of gravity, someone they hated to follow but followed nonetheless. It all came to a head during a full-unit combat exercise, the kind meant to simulate chaos, with instructors barking conflicting orders, smoke grenades spewing confusion, and mock enemies ambushing from every angle. Recruits stumbled, cursed, lost track of commands. Teams splintered, communication broke, and panic seeped through the ranks. In the middle of it all, she moved like a compass. Her voice cut through the haze, sharp and precise, rallying her group, pulling scattered recruits into formation. She dragged one man out of the mock kill zone by his harness, shoved another back into cover, and directed fire with the authority of someone who had been doing it for years. Instructors circled like vultures, waiting to pick apart mistakes, but found themselves watching her instead, their shouts faltering for the briefest second. When the exercise ended, the recruits collapsed in heaps, chest heaving, sweat stinging their eyes. She stood in the center, mud streaked across her face, her chest rising and falling, but her eyes steady, focused, alive. The men around her glanced at one another, then at her, the realization settling heavy. The one they had laughed at, dismissed, mocked, she was the one leading them out of the storm. And though no one dared say it aloud yet, the truth was written on every face. She wasn't just keeping up with the SEALs. She was dominating them, and in their hearts, they knew it. Hell Week arrived like a specter that had haunted them since the first day of training, whispered about in the barracks and dreaded in the pit of every recruit's stomach. It was the crucible, the test that separated those who dreamed from those who endured, and for many, it was the breaking point. 5.5 days of relentless physical punishment, cold that drilled into bones, sleep deprivation so brutal that hallucinations clawed at the edges of sanity. When the instructors announced its beginning, a heavy silence swept the unit. Men clenched their jaws, some muttered prayers, others stared at the sand as if searching for strength buried beneath it. She stood among them, the same calm expression she had worn since day one, but now her eyes gleamed with something sharper, something that dared the storm to come. The first night began with boat carriers, massive rocks hoisted above their heads as instructors screamed for speed. The sand was soft, sucking boots down, the ocean wind cutting against their skin, and within hours the weight became unbearable. Men staggered, backs bowed, shoulders rubbed raw beneath the rubber edges. Some fell, crushed under the load, their teams shouting as instructors pounced to drag them out. Yet she held her position at the front, her shoulders steady, her arms locked, never once letting the boat dip. When others faltered, she shouted for rhythm, her voice slicing through exhaustion, demanding that her team keep moving. Against their will, they matched her cadence, step by step, as if her sheer willpower had become the spine holding them together. By sunrise, when most recruits were already stumbling in a haze, she was still upright, her eyes bloodshot but unbroken, carrying more than her share of the load. As Hell Week stretched on, the ocean became their tormentor. Surf immersion drills dragged them into icy waves at midnight, instructors demanding they link arms and lie down as the tide crashed over them again and again. Teeth chattered violently, skin turned purple, and men screamed into the wind to stay awake, to stay alive. Some quit, raising hands in surrender, lured by the promise of warmth and rest waiting back at the barracks. Each time the bell rang in the distance, signaling another dropout, the instructors barked with savage satisfaction. But she never raised her hand. When the cold gnawed at her bones, she gritted her jaw, singing louder, daring the others to match her volume. Her voice cracked, raw, but it carried a defiance that refused to be drowned. In the black of night, with the Pacific swallowing their bodies, some recruits clung to her presence like a lifeline, matching her song to stave off the darkness in their own minds. She didn't just endure, she fought, and in that fight she carried others with her. Even the instructors, their faces hardened from years of breaking men, watched her with a flicker of something they rarely showed, interest. The beatings of fatigue grew crueler with each hour. Log PT returned, this time with men so battered they could barely lift the timbers, yet still the instructors demanded perfection. Some cursed through tears, others collapsed under the crushing weight, but she never hesitated to adjust her position, to shoulder more when her teammates faltered. Her body shook, muscles screaming, yet she locked her jaw and drove upward, refusing to let the log dip. The others, shamed by her relentless drive, found strength they thought they had lost, their grunts rising in unison until the command finally came to drop it. The log hit the sand, several men collapsed with it, lying flat, gasping, praying for it to end. She simply sat back on her heels, sweat streaking her mud-coated face, and waited for the next order. That waiting became its own weapon, breaking the spirit of those around her. They saw her refusing to crumble, and it forced them to confront their own weakness. Each hour that passed, her presence became less of a challenge to mock and more of a truth they couldn't deny. She was surviving Hell Week better than most of them. Sleep deprivation carved at their minds like knives. Days blurred into nights, hallucinations twisting shadows into figures, sand into crawling insects. Men stumbled aimlessly, some speaking nonsense, others falling asleep mid-drill only to be jerked awake by instructors screaming in their faces. She wasn't untouched, her eyes glazed at times, her words slurred, her steps faltered. Yet she had mastered something they hadn't, the ability to channel exhaustion into focus. When ordered to navigate through an obstacle course in the dead of night, recruits tripped, cursed, ran in circles. She moved methodically, her body on autopilot, each step precise, every handhold calculated. Her teammates, scattered and lost, began to exuded. By the end, when the last obstacle was cleared, it was she who had brought most of them through, their trust placed in her without spoken acknowledgement. The instructors noticed. Their eyes tracked her now with the intensity of hunters recognizing a wolf among sheep. By the 5th day the unit was skeletal. Lips cracked, skin blistered, shoulders raw and bleeding beneath gear that never left their backs. The bell had claimed nearly half of them, each clang reverberating through the camp like a victory for the ocean and the mud. Those who remained were shadows of themselves, staggering forward only because pride chained them in place. Yet she still walked upright. Her pace slowed, her eyes bloodshot, but her back remained straight, her spirit unbowed. On the final stretch, when recruits were ordered to paddle boats out into the surf and back again, many collapsed before reaching shore. She dug her paddle into the waves with relentless rhythm, shouting commands over the crashing surf, dragging her team back when currents threatened to pull them apart. By the time they returned to land, most recruits collapsed on the sand, sobbing, groaning, or staring blankly into the horizon. She dragged her boat up the shore, dropped it cleanly where ordered, and stood waiting, chest heaving, eyes hollow yet burning. The instructors walked the line, their faces unreadable, watching as another bell rang for the last few who quit at the finish. Then one of them paused in front of her, studying her mud-caked form, her trembling body that refused to fall. "Still standing," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself, before barking the order for the survivors to fall in. The unit shuffled into line, broken men held together by scraps of will, and in the middle of them she stood like steel forged in fire. The laughter that had greeted her arrival weeks ago was a memory now, buried beneath the reality of what every man there had seen with his own eyes. She hadn't just survived Hell Week, she had owned it. When Hell Week ended, the survivors were shells of themselves, dragged into chow halls with 1,000-yard stares, their bodies trembling from days without proper sleep or warmth. Men slumped at the tables, some eating mechanically, others staring blankly at their trays as though the food were a puzzle they no longer had the strength to solve. She sat among them, her posture not perfect but straighter than most, hands steady as she pulled down the couch she desperately needed. Around her, the cruel mutterings that had once trailed her. Seen her rise when stronger men had broken, seen her carry weight, lead, fight, and bleed without surrender. Even those who still bristled at her presence could no longer deny what was true. She had proven herself beyond doubt. The instructors noticed it too. When they walked the lines now, their eyes lingered on her, not with suspicion but with the measured interest reserved for recruits they knew could become assets. Still, training did not slow. If anything, it grew harsher, sharper, more demanding. Hell Week was not the end but only the threshold, and beyond it lay drills meant to transform survivors into operatives capable of surviving any battlefield. And it was here, in the aftermath of Hell Week, that her true dominance began to shine, not just in survival but in skill. The live-fire exercises began under a punishing sun, instructors unleashing a storm of gunfire over sand and brush while recruits crawled, sprinted, and shouted commands. The crack of rifles and the thunder of machine guns filled the air, deafening, disorienting, deliberately overwhelming. Recruits stumbled under the barrage, some hesitating, others freezing in the chaos. She did not. She moved through the course with fluid precision, her weapon steady, her eyes scanning, her body weaving low and fast. She shouted orders as if the chaos were a language only she understood, dragging teammates forward, snapping at them to cover, pushing them when hesitation threatened to kill. The instructors, hidden in observation towers, took notes, murmuring to one another. Her accuracy was undeniable, her tactics sharp, but more than that, her composure under fire set her apart. Where others panicked, she thrived. Where others lost focus, she sharpened. She emerged near the front, rifle in hand, her eyes alive with intensity. For the first time, a few men clapped her shoulder instead of sneering, silent acknowledgments that she had pulled them through what they nearly failed. Respect was no longer whispered. It was growing roots. Close quarters battle drills followed, and it was here that her dominance became undeniable. They were sent into mock buildings filled with targets and obstacles, forced to clear rooms as teams under the constant pressure of instructors screaming for perfection. One mistake could mean failure, one missed angle, one hesitation, and the whole unit suffered. At first, the men struggled to trust her commands, their pride dragging at their obedience, but hesitation was punished ruthlessly in this arena. She didn't wait for permission. She took point, slicing into rooms with swift movements, signaling with crisp gestures, her rifle rising and firing with flawless accuracy. Targets dropped, corners cleared, hallways secured, and all the while she moved with the grace of someone who had been born for it. Her teams, reluctant at first, soon realized following her lead meant success. She kept them alive in the mock scenarios where hesitation killed. And when the instructors reviewed the footage afterward, it was her voice, her movements, her leadership that dominated the recordings. She wasn't just excelling individually anymore, she was pulling entire teams forward. The resentment that had clung to her presence began to erode, not because it vanished on its own, but because men who tried to resist her ended up dragging the unit down. No one wanted to be the weak link, and in drill after drill, she proved herself anything but. One evening, after a brutal combat simulation, a man who had once been her loudest critic sat across from her in the chow hall. His face was still swollen from the sparring match she had dominated weeks ago, but his eyes were different now, softer, humbled. He didn't speak at first, just watched her shovel food with the same efficient focus she did everything. Then finally he muttered, "You're the reason we didn't get smoked today." It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was acknowledgement, and in the world they lived in, acknowledgement carried weight. She nodded once, not gloating, not smug, just accepting the truth as if it had always been inevitable. Because for her it was. As weeks bled into months, the unit began to shift. What had started as mockery transformed into reliance. Men who had once mocked her now lined up behind her in drills, not because they were told to, but because they trusted she knew the way. Instructors pushed harder, testing that bond, sending them on night navigation exercises where darkness swallowed the world whole. Many stumbled, disoriented, their compasses spinning uselessly in their hands. She, however, moved with certainty, mapping stars, listening to wind, reading the terrain with instincts honed by relentless focus. Her small team followed her through forests, across rivers, through swamp, never once losing direction. When they emerged at the extraction point, hours before the rest, the instructors marked it down with barely concealed approval. By then, the truth had become impossible to deny. She wasn't just keeping pace with the SEAL unit. She was redefining it. She had walked in as the subject of ridicule, a novelty they had laughed at. Now she was the one they watched, listened to, and, most importantly, followed. And though none of them would say it aloud, every man knew the same thing when he looked at her. If a real mission came tomorrow, she would be the one they'd trust to lead them out alive. The live mission simulation was the point of no return, the final test before candidates were deemed ready for operations, and it was crafted to break them. The instructors designed it to mimic the unpredictability of real combat. A hostile environment, hidden objectives, ambushes waiting at every corner, exhaustion layered into every second. The recruits were dropped into a dense stretch of wilderness at night, packs loaded with gear that weighed nearly half their body weight, and told only that they had 72 hours to complete the mission. Food was scarce, sleep was nearly non-existent, and instructors shadowed them in the darkness, ready to spring attacks without warning. The unit moved out as a loose knot of bodies, muttering commands, adjusting gear, their boots crunching over leaves. Some whispered about strategy, others already looked lost, but she simply checked her compass, scanned the treeline, and set a steady pace. The men, whether they realized it or not, fell in behind her. They didn't argue, didn't question, because something in her presence demanded obedience. Her calm was their anchor in the sea of uncertainty. Hours blurred as they trudged forward, their breath visible in the cold night air, and when the first mock ambush tore through the silence, blanks exploding, flares searing the darkness, instructors shouting, chaos consumed them. Some recruits dropped flat, others fired wildly into the shadows, panic scattering their formation. She didn't flinch. She barked commands with a sharpness that cut through the noise, pulling her team back into cover, directing fire with lethal precision. Within minutes, what had started as a rout transformed into a coordinated response, her voice the thread stitching order back into the chaos. When the flare smoke cleared and the instructors pulled back, it was her unit that was still standing strong, their line unbroken, and though no one said it, every man knew why. The next day was worse. Fatigue gnawed at their bones, blisters spread raw across their feet, and hunger hollowed them out from within. The forest seemed endless, every step heavier than the last, every shadow a threat. Instructors set traps along the way, simulated mines, tripwires, sudden assaults. Recruits cursed as mistakes piled up, morale fraying under the constant barrage. Yet in every stumble she was there, steady, unyielding. When one man tripped a wire and detonated a mock explosion that would have killed half the squad, she was the first to drag him back to his feet, her voice sharp but focused, shoving him forward instead of wasting time with blame. When exhaustion drove another to the edge of collapse, she shifted, carrying the extra burden with silent determination. The men saw it. They felt it. The same woman they had mocked was now the one carrying their survival on her shoulders, not just with skill but with a willpower that refused to break. And though some still burned with pride, clinging to the belief that they should have been the ones leading, even they couldn't ignore the truth. She was the one keeping them alive. By the second night, hallucinations clawed at the edges of their minds. Shadows twisted into shapes, whispers carried through the trees, and exhaustion turned every sound into a threat. The instructors attacked more viciously now, hitting them with mock grenades, dragging captured recruits into the darkness, forcing the rest to adapt or fail. She adapted. Her mind, though battered, locked onto the mission with laser focus. When they were ambushed near a riverbank, she led a counteroffensive that cut through the chaos like a blade, directing suppressive fire, flanking the attackers, rallying her men to push forward. By the time the instructors called off the assault, her unit was still intact, battered but unbroken, and it was her steady commands that had made the difference. One of the instructors, watching from the shadows, muttered to another, "She's not just surviving this, she's commanding it." The other only nodded, eyes narrowing as he watched her blend seamlessly back into formation, her rifle steady, her shoulders squared against the weight of fatigue. It was no longer just about proving herself. She was showing them all that leadership was not defined by size or strength but by the ability to pull others through hell and keep them moving forward. On the final day, the instructors unleashed their most brutal test. The recruits, ragged and half-delirious, were ordered to assault a fortified compound guarded by role-playing instructors trained to give no quarter. It was the culmination of everything they had learned: coordination, tactics, grit, and failure meant being sent home. The recruits staggered into position, their bodies screaming, their weapons heavy in trembling hands. Doubt hung over them like a shroud, but she cut through it with sharp commands, laying out the assault plan with clarity and confidence. When the signal came, she led from the front, charging through smoke and gunfire, her voice rising above the chaos. She cleared rooms with surgical precision, covered her teammates as they breached doors, and pulled one man back when he froze in a doorway under fire. Every second was a storm of noise and motion, but she moved through it as if she had been born for it, her instincts guiding her faster than thought. By the time the compound was secured, the recruits collapsed in the dirt, some weeping from sheer exhaustion, others lying flat and staring at the sky. She stood in the center, chest heaving, sweat pouring down her face, rifle still clutched in her hands. The instructors walked through the wreckage of the exercise, their faces unreadable, but when their eyes met hers, there was no mistaking the flicker of recognition. She hadn't just passed. She had dominated. And as the recruits gathered what little strength they had left, their eyes drifted to her, not with doubt or resentment anymore, but with something rare in a place built on breaking men: respect. In that moment, they knew she had done what none of them believed possible. She had come into their world as a target of laughter, and now she stood above them, not by chance, not by luck, but because she had earned it in blood, sweat, and fire. Word of her performance spread beyond the boundaries of the training ground like wildfire carried on desert wind. Instructors who rarely spoke of recruits outside their circles began to mention her name in briefings, their words clipped but heavy with meaning. Higher command, skeptical at first, started to take notice. Files were pulled, her background studied, her scores scrutinized with suspicion that such dominance had to be explained by something more than grit. Yet every page, every report, every note painted the same picture. Nothing had been handed to her, nothing faked or manipulated. Her achievements were the result of sheer willpower, relentless discipline, and a mind honed for strategy. Still, her presence stirred controversy. Whispers among officers debated whether she was an exception to the rule or the beginning of a shift that many resisted. Some muttered that the Navy SEALs were not a place for outliers, that she was an anomaly to be tolerated, not celebrated. Others argued that results spoke louder than tradition, that her performance was not just adequate but superior, and to deny it was to deny the very foundation the SEAL ethos claimed to stand on. In the barracks, however, the debates of command mattered little. Among the men who had bled and broken beside her, the truth was already written in their bones. She was one of them, and in many ways she was above them. Her influence on the unit deepened with each passing week. Where once recruits had begrudged her presence, now they sought her out. They asked her advice on tactics, requested to partner with her during drills, mirrored her movements in the hopes of catching a fragment of the sharp efficiency she carried. She never gloated, never reminded them of their past jeers. She simply trained harder, setting a standard they chased. During underwater navigation drills, where recruits often panicked beneath the crushing darkness, she glided through the water with a serenity that belied the danger. Others followed her bubbles through the murk, trusting she would lead them to the marker without error. On the shooting ranges, her accuracy became a legend, bullet holes clustering so tightly that even instructors paused to shake their heads. "Unreal," one of them muttered under his breath, though she pretended not to hear. Slowly, the men stopped measuring themselves against one another and began measuring themselves against her. And though it burned their pride, it also sharpened them. Under her shadow, the entire unit grew stronger, more precise, more resilient. She had become the silent axis around which their progress turned. Command recognized it soon enough. During one particularly brutal exercise, where the unit was tasked with a mock hostage rescue in hostile terrain, an overseeing officer watched closely from the ridge. The mission was designed to fail, its complexity intentionally overwhelming, the odds stacked against success. Yet under her direction, the recruits moved like a machine, covering angles, maintaining formation, advancing with lethal synchronization. She didn't shout for dominance. She gave short, precise orders, her voice steady, her presence commanding without arrogance. When the mock hostage was secured and the exfiltration complete, the officer closed his notebook with a snap. Later, in the after-action review, he leaned back in his chair and said flatly, "She ran that op cleaner than half the teams already deployed." The room went silent, instructors exchanging glances, some nodding in agreement, others stiff with unease. But the statement stood, heavy and irrefutable. She wasn't just passing the course, she was redefining the standard. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Among the brass, old grudges and hardened beliefs flared. Some argued she was a publicity stunt waiting to happen, that allowing her to finish would set a precedent they weren't ready for. Others countered that to deny her would expose hypocrisy, that the SEAL creed demanded the best regardless of who they were. The debates churned in closed rooms, but she knew nothing of them. Her world remained the sand, the ocean, the endless grind of drills and missions. She wasn't there to prove a political point. She was there to prove herself, and that singular focus shielded her from the noise above. If the men around her noticed the tension in the air, they never voiced it. For them, what mattered was survival, and survival meant following the one who had pulled them through fire again and again. She didn't need to convince them anymore. Their respect was no longer begrudging. It was earned, unshakable, and in the crucible of shared suffering, it had transformed into loyalty. The instructors pushed harder, perhaps hoping to find her breaking point, perhaps testing the limits of what she could endure. They crafted scenarios with impossible odds. Night raids under simulated artillery fire, long swims through freezing surf followed by combat drills with no rest, desert marches where heat seared skin and drained life from their veins. Recruits faltered, some collapsed, some begged for medics. She staggered like the rest, her lips cracked, her body bruised and battered, but she never quit. Her eyes, hollow with fatigue, still burned with that same unyielding fire, a fire that spread to those beside her. They stopped laughing long ago. Now they whispered different words, words they never thought they'd say. If she can do it, we can too. She had become their measuring stick, their proof that limits were further than they believed. Instructors who once eyed her with suspicion began to use her as an example. Watch her form. Watch her pace. That's how it's done. The irony wasn't lost on the men, but none of them argued. They had seen the truth too many times to deny it. By the time the final phase of training approached, the transformation was complete. She had walked into Coronado as an outlier, a joke to some, an unwelcome intrusion to others. Now she stood at the heart of the unit, the one they looked to in moments of doubt, the one whose silence carried more weight than their loudest voices. Command still debated, instructors still tested, but among the men there was no question left. She had not only survived the gauntlet, they had watched her dominate it. And in doing so, she had rewritten the story they told themselves about what was possible. For years to come, they would remember the woman who had arrived in their world and shattered every expectation, not with speeches or bravado, but with grit carved into every step, every strike, every command. And though the path ahead was still steep, one truth had already crystallized beyond denial. She had earned her place, and no one, not even the highest ranks, could take it away without betraying the very code they lived by. The final qualification test was whispered about like a myth, a brutal convergence of every skill, every ounce of endurance, and every shred of willpower a recruit possessed. For months, it had loomed at the edges of their conversations, a phantom that could not be ignored. Now it was here, a week-long gauntlet designed to strip away everything except the raw truth of who belonged and who did not. Failure meant dismissal. Success meant acceptance into a brotherhood forged in extremes. For her, it was more than a test. It was the summit of the mountain she had been climbing since the moment she stepped onto Coronado's sand. The instructors said nothing about fairness or equality, they simply outlined the parameters. Land navigation through hostile terrain with no rest, open water swims in punishing currents, full combat simulations against seasoned operators, and constant mental warfare in the form of sleep deprivation, starvation, and disorientation. Most recruits approached it with dread masked as bravado. She approached it with the same silent resolve that had carried her through every storm so far. The first night shattered the unprepared. Sent into the wilderness with only a map, compass, and their rucksacks, the recruits staggered across terrain littered with hidden traps and false trails. Rain fell in sheets, turning dirt paths into sucking mud. Men cursed, stumbled, and fought to keep moving. She pressed forward, her frame bent beneath the weight of gear, every step calculated, deliberate. Hours blurred into dawn, and dawn into another dusk. When others collapsed under trees to steal forbidden minutes of sleep, she stayed moving, her eyes fixed on the glow of her compass and the terrain etched into her memory. Hunger gnawed at her belly, thirst cracked her lips, and muscles screamed for mercy, but mercy was not in her vocabulary. When the checkpoints came into view, her name was always among the first called, her presence steady, her pace relentless. Even in the shadows of exhaustion, she stood taller than the rest, a figure the others clung to like a beacon. The water phase was worse. The Pacific had no sympathy for men or women, no care for the ambition of humans who tried to conquer it. Waves towered, currents tore at their limbs, salt stung their eyes and lungs. More than one recruit had to be hauled back to shore, their strength spent, their bodies limp in the surf. She dove into the black water without hesitation, her strokes cutting cleanly, her breathing controlled even as the cold bit into her bones. Hours stretched into an eternity, the shoreline shrinking behind them, the horizon indifferent. In the dark, panic whispered in the minds of the strongest men, but she silenced it with rhythm, with the steady cadence of survival. When her arms burned like fire and her legs felt carved from lead, she told herself what she had told herself since day one. One more stroke, one more breath, one more push forward. And when at last they dragged themselves back onto the sand, she rose dripping and trembling, but standing, her eyes sharper than ever. The instructors noted it quietly. She had not just endured, she had led others back with her, guiding panicked recruits through rips and tides until they collapsed beside her on the beach. The combat simulation was the breaking point for many. Designed to mimic the chaos of real warfare, it pitted recruits against seasoned SEALs who gave no quarter. Explosions rocked the ground, smoke obscured vision, live fire cracked over their heads, and ambushes came from every angle. Teams scattered, some recruits froze, others faltered under the weight of fear. She moved with precision, her instincts sharpened by every hardship she had endured. Her commands were short, sharp, decisive, never wasted, never shouted in panic. Under her guidance, a fractured unit reformed, covering sectors, advancing with discipline, extracting hostages with ruthless efficiency. When one man stumbled, she hauled him to his feet without breaking stride. When the enemy tried to flank them, she was already moving to intercept. By the time the simulation ended, the evaluators could not deny what they had seen. Not just competence, but mastery. She had taken chaos and bent it to order, had taken fear and hammered it into strength. Sleep deprivation was the final blade. Days without rest blurred reality into a haze of hallucinations and confusion. Men saw things that weren't there, voices cracked under the strain, hands shook uncontrollably. She felt it too, the weight pressing on her skull, the edges of her vision swimming, the body screaming for release. But she refused to collapse. She walked when her legs wanted to buckle, thought when her mind wanted to unravel, fought when her arms wanted to hang limp. She existed in a world beyond exhaustion, a world where willpower was the only currency, and she had more of it than anyone else. Recruits who had once mocked her now leaned on her presence. her steadiness the only anchor they had left. In those final hours, as the instructors pushed them to their knees with endless drills and punishing marches, she stood, trembling but unbroken, her silhouette defiant against the breaking dawn. When it was over, when the last whistle blew and the recruits collapsed in the sand, silence fell over the beach. Instructors walked among them, their faces unreadable, their clipboards heavy with notes. Some names were called and dismissed, their journeys ended. Others were told they had passed, though barely, their bodies hanging by threads. Then came her turn. She stood in the lineup, mud caked on her skin, eyes bloodshot, frame shaking from the torment. But she was upright, alert, alive. An instructor stepped before her, his face hard as stone. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of silence stretch until it pressed into the lungs of everyone present. Finally, his voice cut through the air, sharp and unyielding. "You've done what many said you couldn't. You didn't just survive. You dominated." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "Welcome to the Brotherhood." No cheers followed. SEALs were not men of applause. But in that silence, something shifted. The recruits, broken and battered, turned to look at her, not with disbelief anymore, but with respect etched into every glance. She had climbed the mountain, crossed the abyss, and shattered the final wall of doubt. What began as resistance ended in recognition. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the anomaly. She was proof incarnate that the impossible was only a word, and she had written her name into a legacy that no one could erase. Graduation day arrived without fanfare, yet its weight pressed heavier than any burden she had carried through training. The sky above Coronado stretched wide and pale, the Pacific rolling endlessly behind the reviewing.